I'm with Gareth Bacon, who is a member of parliament in the UK. Now, you were recently in Israel going down to the Gaza border to see the sites of the October the 7th terror attack. Why did you want to go and visit?
Well, I think it's very useful to go to Israel. I've been to Israel before, but it was before the 7th of October attack. So I wanted to see how different it was. And there's an organization called the Conservative Friends of Israel that takes parliamentarians over to Israel 2 or 3 times a year. And I hadn't been, the last time I went was February of 2023, so 8 months before the 7th of October. And I was asked to go, and so I decided that I would do it. It was early in January, I think the second week of January. So it's the first week that Parliament was back after the recess. And CFI put the agenda together, part of which, obviously, everything it turned out during the 5 days that we were there was reflected in the 7th of October. So we met a lot of people who had, to some extent or another, been involved. And part of which we went down to the Kfar Azar kibbutz, which was one of the kibbutz that was attacked at 6:30 on the day. And we were shown around by a woman called Ayla Epstein, who lives on the kibbutz, or lived, because nobody lives there now. And she showed us around. She was there on the day, and she survived, but many of her family, including her son, did not. And she talked us through in a very matter-of-fact way what happened, almost blow by blow, on the kibbutz, and that was very eye-opening. And then after that, we drove directly from there to the Nova Music Festival site, which was also extremely powerful because they had there's a big memorial there now, and it's like a forest of pictures of all the people that were killed there, and that's very sobering for people like me who live in a country where this sort of thing doesn't happen. To go there and see that, it was, I think all of us on the trip felt that quite deeply.
And a lot of the people there, particularly at the Nova Festival, were so young as well, weren't they?
Yeah, they were. It was a music festival. These were kids. These are young adults at best. Obviously, completely unarmed young adults. They were not a military target. That wasn't the point of the 7th of October, obviously. It was to terrorize. And hundreds of them were killed. And apparently, they weren't an assigned target initially. One of the paragliders was flying over the site and radioed in that there's hundreds of people down here, and they decided to divert and attack them, and killed hundreds of them. It's just appalling. It's very difficult for someone, from my country to compute this because we don't have marauding bands of gunmen in our country by and large, certainly not on this scale. And it was, as I say, it was an educational trip, but a very eye-opening one.
I imagine the mood was very different in Israel since the other times that you've been there.
It was. I mean, Israelis are remarkable people because, they live in a very small country, which they have great historical and psychological ties to for obvious reasons. But they are surrounded by enemies and it's not a new thing. I mean, a lot of people in the West think that the 7th of October is almost an isolated thing. But it's not. I mean, Israel, ever since it was recreated in 1948, the state of Israel has been attacked regularly. And over here, we don't really understand that. And this is one of the reasons why me going there for my personal education was very, very useful. And why do I encourage everyone else to go there? Because you learn a lot more by being on the ground and seeing the sights. But the Israelis just get on with it, which I think is remarkable.
Mm.
Bearing in mind they are surrounded by enemies that do want to kill them, and most Israeli families have got some bad stories to tell in terms of how things have impacted on them personally. And we met many of them this time, far more than we did when we went there in 2023. And it leaves a very big mark. I mean, it's one of those things. I mean, speaking to my colleagues who are with me on this trip, none of us will forget it. It was a very powerful thing.
Mm. Do you have members of CFI who are pro-Palestinian that they have been there as well to see what's happening?
Well, CFI is Conservative Friends of Israel, so I suppose it's obviously there's a pro-Israel slant to it. But whenever we do these trips, we also do go over to the West Bank. We go over to the to Ramallah. The first time we went, I met the Deputy Prime Minister of the Palestinian Authority. We were due to meet the Prime Minister, but he was unavailable on the day. This time, there were no politicians available to meet us, so we met various other people. So we do look at both sides. We go to both sides of the border, which is useful. And we got to the first time we went over, we met a Palestinian polling expert. Forgive me, I can't remember his name. And that was very useful and educational because obviously in the West Bank, there haven't been elections since 2006, which to Western ears means, you start raising questions about that. But the reason they haven't apparently is because Fatah, who run the West Bank, are acutely aware if they have elections, there's a good chance that Hamas might take power in the West Bank. Fatah and Hamas hate each other and tend to fight each other, which is exactly what happened in Gaza, where Hamas are in power. And that's why they haven't had it, because they thought if Hamas take power in the West Bank, there's going to be all-out war in the Middle East. Well, obviously there is conflict in the Middle East anyway, but the West Bank are not involving themselves directly in the war in Gaza, which is interesting. And that would have been the case had Hamas been in power there. So all of these things are things that I think in the West, we just we don't understand this. We don't know this enough. And there's a lot of ignorance spoken. When the Prime Minister talks about, the British Prime Minister talks about a two-state solution, which state is he talking about? He's talking about Gaza, or he's talking about the West Bank, because they're not the same place. And they're not run by the same people. And there's Israeli territory in between the two. So, how does that work? And this kind of ignorance in Western Europe, I think, is worrying, because lots of people have opinions about what's going on, but almost nobody knows what they're talking about.
Imagine if you give a two-state solution to Gaza, make that as the land, you've got Hamas. Hamas are in power, so how can that be having the terrorists in power?
Well, it's I don't see how that can work. I mean, part of Donald Trump's 20-point peace plan is that Hamas have to demilitarize and withdraw from all aspects of government. And you can understand that because, of course, they exist to kill Israelis and to kill Jews. So how could Israel possibly tolerate a Hamas government, especially after the 7th of October? But Hamas are not demilitarizing. If anything else, they are rearming and retraining. That was the evidence that we saw when we didn't go into Gaza, we went to the border, and that's what we heard from the civilian military organization that's down there, that's being headed up by a US general. So it is deeply worrying. The situation. I don't think it's over, unfortunately.
No. What sort of stories did you hear from some of the survivors?
Well, some of them are quite hair curling. We met. I can't remember the name. Let me have a look and see if I can get his name. I'm just looking at my notes from when I was there. I think it was arranged last minute, so it's not on my notes. But there was a man that we met in Jerusalem. Who was the father of a young man who was killed at the Nova Music Festival site. Now, this particular man was in the IDF. He was off duty and he had gone to the concert with some friends. And when it was apparent that they were being attacked, that this was a full-blown attack, a lot of people ran for the nearest shelter. And I saw the shelter when I was there. And there were about 25 people crammed into this. There wasn't sufficient space. And he took charge and he got everyone to get on the floor. And Hamas were clearing the site, so they attacked the shelter. And they were throwing grenades in, and he threw them back. And with his bare hands, he killed 2 or 3 Hamas attackers. And so he threw something like 7 grenades back out of the shelter. The 8th grenade exploded and killed him. And then Hamas killed some of the people in the shelter, took some others prisoner and took them into Gaza. Obviously, they've all been released now, or their bodies have been released. We met the father of that young soldier who was doing that. And he showed us videos. His son was a concert level pianist, as well as being a very accomplished infantry soldier, apparently. And listening to him talk about his son, this was his eldest son as well. He had 7 or 8 children, I think, and this was the eldest son. When you hear tales of complete heroism like that, I mean, he had his bare hands, he wasn't armed, and he was against a fully armed Hamas gunman who was there intent on killing him and killing as many people as possible. That sort of heroism is the kind of thing that people of my generation don't encounter very often.
Yeah.
And when you hear this man talking about his son and the way that he spoke about him, when I listen to Ayla Epstein talking about what happened in the kibbutz and how her son died, because her son died saving his fiancée. He jumped on a grenade and they didn't know that she was in the room, so he could absorb the explosion of the grenade to save her. Things like this are just, it made my eyes water, to be honest. When we said goodbye to Aylet at the kibbutz, I wanted to say something to her to convey how much this had impacted on me. And I went and shook her hand, and then found I couldn't speak. So I gave her a hug instead, because it was such a hard thing to listen to, because it wasn't just her son that died. I think 4 other members of her family were killed that day.
Mm.
And that's very difficult to listen to.
Yeah, yeah. Did you meet any of the hostages or hostage family members?
No, we didn't. I think that was planned, but it wasn't available, unfortunately. But there have been hostages who've come into Parliament. I haven't met any personally, but I know that some of my colleagues have, and I can only imagine how harrowing that is. I've seen the photographs of the hostages. Now, these would have been people kept underground for a long period of time who didn't know that they were going to live or die. They were barely fed, living in very unsanitary conditions. Many of them did die in captivity. This is all appalling.
Mm.
It's really, really grim stuff. So, it's one of those things that it needs to end, but I don't know how it ends really, because when you're fighting against people that it's part of their belief system, that dying for the cause is something to be sought, not just accepted, sought. I'm not sure how you end that peaceably.
Yeah, yeah. Did you see the 43-minute video that Israel produced before you actually went out to the
Yes,
south?
I did. I saw it in Parliament a couple of months before I went, and it's one of the most appalling things I've ever seen.
Mm.
And bearing in mind, it's not just produced, or the footage is not just Israeli. Some of it was taken from Hamas mobile phones and from CCTV in people's homes and on the street, and dash cam footage from cars that were driving by that were shot at. It's horrendous. The lack of humanity in that film is incredible. And we watched it again in Israel. And when I looked at the agenda and we were flying over on the plane on the way, I said to the lady that was running the CFI director, we had a chat about it because I said, look, on the one hand, I would rather not see that film again. I've seen it. It's not something I need to see again. But on the other, I don't really want to offend our hosts. So, and in the end, I did watch the film again. But it was, it's one of those things you never forget. I had to keep telling myself I wasn't watching a drama.
Yeah.
I was watching real life. And,
Yeah.
that was horrendous.
Does all of this help you to understand Israel's war, particularly at the moment? We've got Iran. Iran are sponsors of terror, including Hamas. So seeing the video and going down to the sites, does that actually help you to understand today? Because obviously Israel's getting criticism for what they're doing in Iran at the moment. So does that help you in any way?
It does. I mean, Iran is probably the greatest state sponsor of terrorism the world has ever seen, because obviously Iran fund Hezbollah, they fund Hamas, they fund the Houthi rebels. They're behind virtually every Islamist terror attack over many years. Somehow traces its way back to Iran. And the idea of a nuclear-armed Iran is something that should keep people awake at night. I think. So I kind of do understand what's happening. I don't know what the precise trigger was because Iran has been known to be doing lots of this stuff behind the scenes, and I don't think the Israelis and Americans have particularly well communicated precisely why now they've decided to do this. And I think that they would have benefited by doing that, so that people can understand why this is happening, because there is a huge depth of ignorance generally about the situation in the Middle East. And when we were over in Israel, we met the Deputy Foreign Minister, Sharon Haskell. And we'd been down to to talk to the Civil Military Coordination Centre. And it became apparent to us when we were there that Donald Trump had set March, fun enough, and today is it was the penultimate day in March, as the deadline for Hamas to disarm. And they weren't disarming. There was no interest in them disarming, which implies that there's likely to be further escalation in Gaza, because if they're not going to disarm, then the peace plan isn't going to work.
Yeah.
The only military force in the region that is capable of doing anything about that is the IDF, which means that, very likely there's a chance that Israel and Hamas could be in conflict again very soon. And I remember saying to the minister, I'm assuming your military is prepared for this, but what about your communications plan? Because Israel is losing the communications war because they are not communicating what is happening. Similarly, with Iran, which is a massive escalation in the tension, obviously, in the Middle East, a lot of people over here don't know why this is happening. And it tends to focus a lot on Donald Trump because he is regarded by many in the Western world as a liability. So we soap operize politics over here, and because he's regarded as this almost cartoon character in some senses, a lot of it is focusing around him, and a lot of it is focusing around Israel, because Israel is regarded as the bad player, unbelievably, in the Middle East. And I do think that Israel and America would profit greatly by being a bit more open with their communications.
Mm. Now you've spoken to these people and you've heard their stories and their moving stories. So when you see the marches in the UK, how do you feel about that when you see marches every Saturday in London?
Um, well, I don't think they should be allowed, to be honest. I mean, I had an argument with the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police back in, it was approaching, it was the first week of November 2023. He had a meeting with Conservative London-based MPs at the time. And the Home Secretary at the time was very publicly encouraging him to request the power to ban the marches, which he did do with the Al-Quds March a couple of weeks ago. And he refused to do that, claiming he didn't have the legal power. He does have the legal power, and he should have banned them, because what was happening was anti-Semitism in plain sight, and that has led to a massive increase in anti-Semitism in this country. Recently, the attack on the 4 Jewish ambulances in North London, last week, is the latest example of that. And it has massively escalated tensions over here, and it should have been stopped right at the outset. So when I see these marches, I don't, I just think sometimes I don't recognize my own country, because, we now have anti-Semitism apparently regarded as mainstream, which it should never be. I mean, it really is appalling now in this country that British-born Jews can't walk around safely. They have to have security on, at Jewish schools, at synagogues, and it almost seems to be open season, and I think that's just dreadful.
Can government actually deal with anti-Semitism? Because anti-Semitism seems to be something of the heart, and you can't really change someone's heart if they hate something.
Well, and that's a very good question. I think it needs to be clamped down on more forcibly and more visibly, because the Metropolitan Police are in a difficult position, because their primary focus on these marches is to maintain civil order, and they insist that they are watching the crowds and they arrest people afterwards, and et cetera, et cetera. But the trouble is, nobody sees them doing that. So, justice needs to be not just done, but seen to be done in this country. And if you have, as we did in the early marches, people walking around waving signs for jihad, standing next to a police officer who's standing there doing nothing, that looks an awful lot like toleration of anti-Semitism. And, I think that we need to turn the screw a little bit on some of this stuff, because it now, 2 years in, the rise in anti-Semitism in this country, open anti-Semitism, is something that I've never seen before. And, it's not for the betterment of this country.
Mm. Now you serve Orpington. Are you able to fight anti-Semitism in your area? And do you have Jews in your area?
Not many. I mean, Orpington is southeast London, or Kent. It's more akin to Kent, really. So we don't have a large Jewish population. So I've not really had to do. We don't have a large Muslim population either. And the other thing that I should say about the Muslim populations around the country is it would be a tremendous mistake to assume that all Muslims take the same view on all of this stuff, because of course they don't. There are some that take this position, but not all. And that's a big problem, because the temptation is to start dividing lines, say, well, all Jews do this and all Muslims do that and all Hindus do this and all Catholics do that and all Church of England people do that. once you start to fragment society like that, you end up in a very tense place. And this is one of the greatest things is that to be regretted about what's been happening in the Middle East in the last couple of years is that our society is starting to fragment along sectarian lines, and that's not where we need to be at all.
Mm. Why do you support Israel?
Sorry?
Why do you support Israel?
Because I think Israel is a very tolerant, pluralistic democracy. When I listen to people talking about Israel being an apartheid state,
Mm.
having been there myself, I have never been onto the top of Temple Mount because whenever I've been in Israel, whenever I've been in Jerusalem, it's tended to be a Friday. And on Friday, nobody other than Muslims are allowed on Temple Mount. Now, if Israel was the apartheid state that it is proclaimed to be by its detractors, why on earth would they allow the most sacred place in the whole of Judaism to be run by people from another religion? They simply wouldn't do that. That is not the case. I think Israelis, they just, from all the Israelis that I've met, just want to live their lives. They want to live in their country and have, the same kind of lives that we do. Now, that's not to say that there aren't some things that the Israeli government could do differently, or that everything they do is perfect and altruistic. But I don't think you'll find any human beings on earth that are perfect and altruistic. So, I think Israel is it's a democracy in a sea of tyranny, in a part of the world that's always going to be very, very difficult. I think that if we could ever get to a two-state solution, that would be the optimum place to be. But there are so many barriers to that at the moment. I'm not sure that we'll get to that anytime soon.
What is your hope for the future for Israel and for the Jewish people, particularly the Jewish people in the UK?
Well, in the UK, I hope they can just live their lives. I mean, this country has been religiously pluralistic for a long time. I mean, um, uh, there has been discrimination in the past. I'm a Roman Catholic, and Catholics for centuries in this country were persecuted and oppressed. That hasn't been the case since the Catholic Emancipation Act back in the 1830s. So, and Jews have lived in this country for centuries. And they lived perfectly peaceably alongside everybody else. We need to get back to that. We need to get back to people not feeling that they can't walk around their own capital city anymore because they are a certain religion. That should never be the case. And I hope we do get back to that. And I hope that in the Middle East we can reach a situation where peace is the norm rather than antagonism and bloodshed. It used to be said that you could never get that in places like Northern Ireland because Catholics and Protestants were taught to hate each other. Well, that hasn't been the case for 3 decades now, more than 3 decades. So if it can be achieved there, surely it can be achieved in the Middle East as well. And that's what I would hope for.
Yeah. Well, Gareth, thank you very much for sharing today.
My pleasure, Paul. It's nice to meet you.